He called me keeper. For 19 years I had maintained the chronometry archives beneath the Basilica Administratum on Mordian Secundus, cross-referencing temporal records with astropathic transmission logs, verifying the synchronization that kept 17 sectors aligned to Terran Standard Time. My work was precision incarnate. The priests said I kept the Emperor's time itself. When the timestamps began to drift by microseconds, then seconds, then minutes, I discovered that faith has a half-life, and mine was measured in the growing silence between stars. What does loyalty mean when the light you've followed your entire life begins to dim? My name is Hadrian Vex. I served as chronometric specialist, 3rd class, for 19 years and 47 days. And this is how I learned that some failures are not catastrophes but revelation. I rose each morning at 5 hours exactly, not approximately. Exactly. The chrono bell in my habitation cell chimed once, a pure tone calibrated to Terran Standard, and I was already moving. Cold water from the basin. Gray robes, worn soft by decades of identical mornings. Breakfast was protein wafer and recaf, consumed in 7 minutes while reviewing the previous day's synchronization report. By 6 hours, I was descending the 912 steps into the archives, my footsteps echoing in rhythm. I could have walked blind. The archives were maintained at 11 degrees Celsius, cold enough that your breath misted. Cold enough that the ancient chronometers, some dating back to the age of apostasy, remained stable within their climate-controlled reliquaries. The air tasted of machine oil and sanctified unguents, sweet metal and old paper. 1,700 chronometers lined the vaulted chamber, each one a master reference synchronized to the astronomican pulse. My task was sacred: ensure every chronometer maintained perfect alignment, that every timestamp across 17 sectors matched Holy Terra's heartbeat. Time itself flowed through this chamber, precise and absolute. I loved my work. That is important to understand. I took pride in the calibrations, the micron adjustments, the careful documentation. Each morning I would inspect the primary synchronization array, comparing local atomic decay to the astropathic pulse timing. The numbers always matched. Always. The Emperor's light was constant, and so was my duty. I recited the litany of temporal constancy while I worked, the words familiar as breathing. As Terra turns, so turn all worlds. As the Emperor's light marks eternity, so do we mark the hours. In his sight, all moments are known. 16 years of mornings speaking those words, and I believed every syllable. My supervisor was chronologist Prime Severin, a woman who had held her position for 43 years. She walked with a cane carved from a tree that had grown in the shadow of the imperial palace, or so she claimed. Her eyes were augmetic, pale blue lenses that clicked and whirred when she read the calibration logs. She said I was the finest specialist she'd ever trained, that my attention to detail honored both the administratum and the throne itself. When she placed her hand on my shoulder after I'd corrected a .003 drift in sector Helican without prompting, I felt something approximating contentment. Purpose. Meaning. The basilica above us thrummed with prayer at all hours. 10,000 voices raised in the hymn of Terra's dawn at 7 hours, the deep bass of the noon angelus. Evening vespers that shook dust from the archive's ancient stones. I could tell time by the prayers alone, another layer of precision woven through my days. Sometimes I would pause in my calibrations to listen, to let the sound wash through me. The Emperor protects, the Emperor provides, the Emperor guides. These were not merely words, but the architecture of reality itself. My colleagues and I rarely spoke. Chronometry demands silence, concentration, the absence of distraction. But there was communion in our shared purpose. Archivist Mellon at Station 7, who specialized in gravitational time dilation calculations for void traffic. Specialist Crossed at Station 12, who maintained the tidal resonance chronometers for ocean worlds. We moved through the chamber like components in a vast machine, each performing our function with perfect precision. When Severin announced our efficiency rating had achieved a new peak, 99.97% accuracy, We allowed ourselves a moment of collective satisfaction. We were keeping the Imperium synchronized. We were doing the Emperor's work. The first anomaly occurred on a morning like any other. 3rd day of the week, 2nd month of Terran Standard Year 3, 5th century of the 41st millennium. I was performing my standard inspection of the primary array when I noticed the timestamp drift. 0.17 seconds. Negligible, well within acceptable variance, but unusual. The Astronomicon pulse was the most stable reference in the galaxy. It simply did not drift. I recalibrated. Checked the receiving array. Verified the atomic reference. The drift persisted. 17 seconds. I made a note in the log, classified it as routine variance, and continued my rounds. The chronometers at stations 4 through 9 all showed identical drift, not random fluctuation, which would vary between instruments. Identical drift. As though the source itself had shifted, I told myself it was instrument error. The receiving array was 7 centuries old, maintained but ancient. Perhaps a relay had degraded. Perhaps the sanctified oils needed renewal. I filed a maintenance request and thought nothing more of it. This is what faith does. It provides explanation before investigation, comfort before comprehension. I wanted it to be instrument error, so I decided it was. The next day the drift was 0.031 seconds. The day after, 0.044 seconds. By the end of the week we had drifted almost a full second from Terran Standard. Severin called an emergency calibration assembly. 15 specialists gathered around the primary array while she recited the rite of temporal realignment. We adjusted every instrument, performed every diagnostic, re-sanctified every relay. When we finished, the drift had corrected for 6 days. Then it began again. Slower this time, more gradual, but inexorable. 0.08 seconds. 0.13 seconds. 0.021 seconds. A pattern emerging like sickness. I began checking the array every hour, instead of every morning. Severin said nothing, but I saw her augmetic eyes clicking more frequently, focusing and refocusing on the readouts, as though sheer scrutiny could stabilize them. In the 3rd week, an astropathic communique arrived from Sector Helicon. Their chronometry installations were experiencing similar drift. They requested our diagnostic data. We transmitted our logs, and they confirmed. Identical pattern, identical magnitude, identical progression, not instrument failure. The source was changing. I remember standing before the primary array that evening, after the others had ascended to their habs. The chronometers ticked in perfect unison, 1,700 mechanical heartbeats measuring time's passage, except they weren't perfect anymore. They were drifting from Terra, all in the same direction, all at the same rate. I placed my hand against the closest reliquary, feeling the vibration of its mechanism through the blessed glass. Severin had taught me that these instruments were consecrated, that they carried a fragment of Terra's holiness within them. What did it mean when holy things stopped aligning? The question frightened me. So I buried it beneath procedure. I filed reports, performed calibrations, recited litanies. I was very good at maintaining routine when routine was threatened. It was easier to adjust the instruments than to consider what the drift meant. By the 5th week, we had drifted 7 seconds from Terran Standard. The Basilica priests began asking questions. Why were the morning bells no longer synchronizing with their astronomical observation? Why did the chronometric displays in the administratum upper levels contradict the archives? Severin met with them privately. When she returned, her face was composed, but her hands shook slightly as she gripped her cane. She gathered us at Station 1 and spoke in a voice that admitted no uncertainty. There is a fluctuation in the astropathic pulse timing. The Mechanicus is investigating. We will maintain our instruments to the pulse as measured, not as predicted. This is now official policy. Adjust your calibrations accordingly. Crossed raised a hand. Chronologist Prime, if the pulse is fluctuating, does that mean? It means we maintain our instruments. Severin's augmetic eyes focused on him with machine precision. We are chronometric specialists. We measure time as it is, not as we believe it should be. That is our duty. That is our faith. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe that this was simply recalibration. We were responding to new data rather than confronting new reality. But that night, alone in my hab, I found myself unable to sleep. I lay in darkness and thought about the Astronomicon, the Emperor's Light, the psychic beacon that guided every navigator through the warp, that synchronized every chronometer in the Imperium. Constant, eternal, absolute, except it was drifting. The thought was ice in my chest. If the Astronomicon itself was becoming unstable, what did that mean for the Imperium, for humanity, for everything we'd built across 10,000 years? I tried to pray, to recite the litany of temporal constancy, but the words caught in my throat. As Terra turns, so turn all worlds. But what if Terra's light was dimming? The Emperor's light marks eternity. But what if eternity was finite after all? I pushed the thoughts away. Severin was right. We measured time as it was. We were not theologians or astrologers. We were specialists, and our duty was precision, not interpretation. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to find the calm that had always come from ritual. Tomorrow, I would descend the 912 steps. I would perform my calibrations. I would maintain the instruments, purpose, meaning, duty. Faith is a structure you build inside your mind, stone by stone, prayer by prayer, until it becomes the foundation of your entire existence. Doubt is the first crack in that foundation. You can ignore it, you can deny it, you can call it weakness or temptation, but once you've felt it, once you've acknowledged its presence, it spreads, stone by stone, prayer by prayer, until the structure begins to crumble. I did not know it then, but that night was the last time I would sleep soundly. The last time I would descend those steps with certainty. The last time I would believe that precision and duty were sufficient answers to the questions forming in the darkness. The drift was only the beginning. What came after would crack faith itself. But I still believed. I still wanted to believe. That has to matter. The drift accelerated. By the third month, we were 17 seconds behind Terran Standard. By the fourth, 41 seconds. Severin stopped holding assemblies. She simply transmitted new calibration protocols each morning. And we adjusted the instruments in silence. The work became mechanical, joyless. We were no longer maintaining synchronization. We were documenting desynchronization. Other sectors began reporting similar phenomena. Not just Helican, but Calixis, Scarus, Gothic. Reports arrived via astropathic relay, and I was assigned to log and cross-reference them. This gave me access to information most specialists never saw. Raw data from across the segmentum, pattern, analysis, predictive models. What I discovered made my hands tremble. The drift was not random. It was accelerating in a mathematically precise curve. Not the gradual degradation of failing equipment, but something systematic, something with a shape. I plotted the data points on graph vellum, drawing the curve by hand because I needed to see it physically, needed to trace its contour with my own fingers. The acceleration followed exponential decay function, which meant if the pattern held, the drift would reach a critical threshold. I calculated when that threshold would occur. 14 months, maybe 15. After that, the mathematics broke down. The drift would either stabilize at an impossible magnitude, or the synchronization would simply cease. No more Astronomicon pulse, no more Emperor's light. I stared at the graph vellum for an hour. Then I burned it. I told myself I was wrong, that my calculations contained some error, that surely the Mechanicus, adepts with their sophisticated cogitators, would have noticed this pattern if it were real. But I knew my mathematics was sound. I'd been trained by the finest chronometric specialists in the sector. The pattern was real. The question was what it meant. I began investigating carefully, accessing files I technically had authorization to view but normally would never request. Historical synchronization data going back centuries. Previous anomalies and their resolutions. anything that might explain what we were experiencing. The archive's data repositories were vast, and I knew their organization systems better than anyone except Severin herself. I worked late into the night cycle, pulling records, cross-referencing dates, building a timeline of imperial chronometric history. What I found was absence. Gaps, periods where certain records should exist but didn't. 10-year spans where synchronization logs were marked as classified by inquisitorial seal. Decades where drift patterns similar to ours had been noted then. The files simply ended with no resolution recorded, not deleted, just stopped, as though someone had decided the information no longer needed documentation. One file in particular caught my attention, a synchronization report from 400 years ago, logged by chronometric specialist Yara Menz. She had documented a drift pattern identical to what we were experiencing. Identical magnitude, identical acceleration curve, identical sectors affected. Her report spanned 7 months, growing progressively more detailed and desperate. She had made the same calculations I had, reached the same conclusion, and in her final entry she had written a single sentence. I had requested emergency audience with chronologist Prime Verum to present evidence requiring immediate escalation to Sector Command. The next document in the file was her death certificate. Cause: equipment malfunction during routine maintenance. The accident report was perfunctory, signed by Verum himself. Yara Menz had died 3 days after requesting that emergency audience. I read the file 3 times, then I filed it back in its proper location and returned to my station. My hands were steady. My breathing was controlled. Inside, something cold had taken root. Yara Menz had seen what I was seeing. She had tried to escalate. She had died in an accident that occurred at a very convenient time. Coincidence? It had to be coincidence. The Imperium was vast, accidents happen, and correlation was not causation. These were the words I told myself while walking back to my hab through corridors lit by flickering loom strips, but I could not make myself believe them. The absence of belief, the vacuum where certainty used to live, was terrifying. The next morning, Specialist Crost was absent from his station. Severin announced he had been transferred to Segmentum Solar to assist with priority recalibration efforts. His station remained empty. His personal effects were already cleared. I had seen him yesterday evening performing his standard duty cycle. If he'd been selected for transfer, surely there would have been some preparation, some notice, some ceremony of departure. I asked Melon about it during the brief meal cycle break. She looked at me with exhausted eyes and said nothing, just shook her head slightly and returned to her protein wafer. The message was clear. Do not ask questions, do not investigate, do not become like Crost, who had mentioned at assembly that the drift pattern seemed designed rather than random. 2 weeks later, I was performing maintenance on Station 12, which had been Crost's specialty. I found something he'd left behind, wedged behind the primary chronometer, housing where only someone with specialist knowledge would think to look. A data slate, its screen cracked but functional. When I activated it, I found a single text file. No date. No author attribution. Just words: the throne is failing. This is not political rumor or heretical speculation. This is mathematical certainty derived from synchronization data spanning 4 centuries. The astronomic instability is degrading according to a predictable curve. Someone in authority knows this. Someone has known this for centuries. The purges of chronometric specialists occur at regular intervals whenever the pattern becomes undeniable and someone attempts escalation. We are not measuring time's passage. We are measuring the Emperor's dying. Delete this file. Trust nothing. Remember everything. I held the data slate for a long time, reading those words again and again until they blurred. The throne is failing. 4 simple words that unmade reality. If true, then everything I'd devoted my life to, every calibration and litany and moment of purpose, was documentation of decay. We weren't maintaining the Imperium's temporal infrastructure. We were recording its collapse in microsecond increments. If true, I looked around the archive chamber. 1,700 chronometers ticking in unison, each one marking time that no longer aligned with Holy Terra. 15 specialists at their stations, performing calibrations that grew more extreme each day. Severin walking between stations with her cane, her augmetic eyes clicking as she verified our work. All of us maintaining the fiction that this was routine, that we were simply responding to minor fluctuations, that faith and duty were sufficient. What if faith was obedience to a lie? What if duty meant complicity in the documentation of humanity's extinction? I wiped the data slate and returned it to its hiding place. Then I continued my maintenance cycle. But that evening, instead of returning to my hab, I descended further into the archives, into the restricted sections where historical records were sealed under administrative authority. I had maintenance authorization. No one questioned my presence. The sealed records went back to the heresy itself. Careful documentation of every significant temporal event in Imperial history. I worked backward from the present, tracing the pattern. The drift we were experiencing had happened before. Not once, 17 times. Every 2 to 3 centuries, the Astronomican pulse would begin degrading, the drift would accelerate, and then suddenly, without explanation, it would stabilize. Resolution would be marked as Mechanicus intervention or throne maintenance with no further detail, but the intervals were growing shorter. The first episode lasted 19 months before stabilization. The second, 16 months. The third, 14. Each episode slightly shorter than the last, as though whatever mechanism resolved the crisis was itself degrading. The current episode had lasted 4 months already. If the pattern held, we might have 10 months remaining before critical threshold. Or we might have less. I found a subfile marked with inquisitorial seal, classification level that technically exceeded my clearance. But the archives organization system had a flaw I'd discovered years ago during routine maintenance. Certain cross-reference protocols allowed indirect access to sealed materials through temporal correlation searches. I exploited that flaw. The subfile contained contingency protocols, emergency procedures for what the administration termed celestial navigation failure events. I read through pages of logistics planning, evacuation priorities, succession protocols for when interstellar communication became impossible. The procedures assumed complete loss of the Astronomican. They assumed the Imperium would fragment into isolated sectors, each one fighting for survival in absolute darkness. They assumed the Emperor's light would fail entirely. These were not theoretical exercises. They were operational plans, updated as recently as 50 years ago, with assigned command authorities and resource allocation. Someone, somewhere in the Administratum's highest reaches, believed the Astronomican could fail. They had planned for it. They were preparing for it. The document's final section was titled Information Containment Protocols. I read it with cold clarity, my emotions distant, analytical. The protocols specify that chronometric specialists showing signs of pattern recognition or extrapolative analysis beyond their assigned functions were to be transferred to priority assignments where their expertise could be properly utilized. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Specialists who understood what the drift signified disappeared, not into important work, but into silence. Yarmens. Crossed. How many others over 400 years? I sat in that restricted chamber, surrounded by centuries of careful lies, and felt something fundamental break inside me. Not faith exactly. Faith was already crumbling. What broke was the structure I'd built my entire life around. Purpose. Meaning, the belief that my work mattered, that precision and duty served something greater than themselves. All of it was documentation of managed collapse. The Imperium knew its heart was failing. The Administratum was preparing for fragmentation, and we, the chronometric specialists, were simply measuring how much time remained. We were counting down to midnight, and when midnight came, no dawn would follow. I thought about Severin then. Her 43 years of service, her pride in our efficiency ratings. her augmetic eyes clicking as she verified our calibrations. Did she know? Had she always known? When she placed her hand on my shoulder and called me her finest specialist, was she grateful for my precision or for my obedience? I returned to my hab in the deep night cycle. I did not sleep. I lay in darkness and calculated. 14 months until critical threshold, maybe less. The throne was failing. The Emperor's light was dimming, and the Imperium's response was to measure the darkness and silence anyone who spoke its name aloud. I had to tell someone. I had to report this to Sector Command, to the Administratum Lords, to someone with authority to act. The thought formed before I could stop it, and immediately I recognized it as what had killed Yara Menz, the dangerous belief that truth mattered more than survival, that someone higher up would want to know, that the system would respond to evidence rather than silence it. But what was the alternative? Continue my calibration, document the drift with greater precision, descend the 912 steps each morning and maintain instruments measuring our extinction. Could I do that? Could I perform my duty knowing it was performance, theater, the careful documentation of a lie? I thought about Crost's data slate. Delete this file, trust nothing, remember everything. But what use was remembering if I remained silent? What good was knowledge if I took no action? Morning came. The chrono bell chimed. I rose mechanically, washed, dressed, descended the steps. My hands performed their functions. My voice recited the litanies. But something had changed. I was no longer Hadrian Vex, chronometric specialist, keeper of the Emperor's time. I was someone watching Hadrian Vex perform those functions while standing slightly apart, observing, analyzing, recognizing the performance for what it was: compliance, complicity, the maintenance of comfortable fiction because confronting truth would destroy the structure that gave life meaning. That afternoon, Severin summoned me to her private station. She sat behind her desk, her augmetic eyes focused on me with mechanical precision. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached into a drawer and withdrew a data slate. My data slate, the one I'd hidden in my hab, containing my calculations, my graph vellum recreations, my analysis of the historical patterns. How long have you known? She asked. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. I could have denied it, could have claimed ignorance, confusion, that the data slate wasn't mine. But I was exhausted from carrying knowledge alone. Exhausted from performing faith I no longer felt, so I told the truth. 3 weeks since I found Yara Men's file, since I accessed the contingency protocols. Severin nodded slowly. Her hands were folded on the desk, trembling slightly. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, the weight of decades suddenly visible in the lines of her face. 43 years, she said quietly. I have maintained these archives for 43 years. Do you know how many specialists I've trained? 67. Do you know how many of them discovered what you've discovered? 19. Do you know what happened to them? I said nothing. I already knew. They were transferred. Her augmetic eyes clicked. To segmentum solar, to specialized duty, to classified assignments. That's what the orders always said. I filed the paperwork myself, signed the transfer authorizations, cleared their stations. I told myself they were being utilized elsewhere, that their expertise was needed, that the administratum knew best. She opened a drawer and withdrew a sheaf of parchment. Transfer orders, dozens of them, going back decades. Names I didn't recognize, specialists who had worked these stations before I arrived, before my time, vanishing into administrative euphemism. I wanted to believe it, Severin continued, because the alternative was admitting I was complicit, that every time I signed those orders, I was collaborating in someone's disappearance, that my duty required me to identify the specialists who understood, to mark them for transfer, to maintain the fiction. She looked at me directly, and for the first time I saw something raw beneath her composure. Not certainty. Fear. The throne is failing, Hadrian. The Astronomicon is degrading according to a pattern documented for 400 years. The Mechanicus cannot repair it. They've tried. Every episode ends the same way. Temporary stabilization followed by continued decay. Each interval shorter than the last. We are measuring the Emperor's dying, and we have been since the heresy. This is not secret knowledge. Everyone at Administratum level 7 and above knows. They've known for millennia. Then why? My voice cracked. Why maintain the measurements? Why continue the documentation? Why kill the specialists who understand? Because, she said, and her voice was hollow, hope is more useful than truth. The Imperium functions on belief. Belief in the Emperor's protection. Belief in the Astronomican's constancy. Belief that the throne will endure. Remove that belief, and the system fractures. So we maintain the measurements. We document the drift. We provide data that makes it look like routine maintenance rather than terminal decline. And we silence anyone who might tell the civilian populations what's actually happening. You knew Yara Menz would die. I signed her transfer order. Severin's hands tightened. 3 days before the accident, I filed the paperwork. I told myself it was routine, that she was going to important work. I never asked what kind of work. I never wanted to know. She pushed the data slate across the desk toward me. You're good at what you do, Hadrian, better than anyone I've trained. Your calculations are correct. We have somewhere between 10 and 14 months before the current episode reaches critical threshold, maybe less if the decay accelerates. The Mechanicus is attempting another stabilization intervention, but their confidence is low. The throne's mechanisms are degrading faster than they can be repaired. We are approaching, perhaps within our lifetimes, the final failure. How can you accept this? The words came out harsh, desperate. How can you continue calibrating instruments when you know what it means? How do you descend those steps every morning and perform your duty knowing it's documentation of extinction? Severin was quiet for a long time. Then she reached up and touched her augmetic eyes, fingers tracing the metal housing. Do you know why I had these installed? Not injury, not disease. I requested augmetics 30 years ago because organic eyes show too much emotion. I needed to be able to look at my specialists, to evaluate their work, to sign transfer orders without revealing what I knew. I needed to be able to maintain composure while performing triage on human beings. She lowered her hands. They were shaking badly now. I continue because someone must, because if everyone who understood refused to participate, the system would collapse immediately rather than gradually, because there are billions of people in these sectors who go about their lives in ignorance, who raise children and build things and find meaning in simple existence. And they can do that because we maintain the fiction of stability. I don't know if that's right. I've questioned it every day for 30 years. But inaction is also a choice. Allowing immediate collapse instead of buying time is also a choice. So I choose to continue. I choose to maintain the instruments. I choose to sign the transfer orders, and I live with what that makes me. You're a collaborator, I said. You're maintaining a lie that leads to humanity's extinction. Yes, she met my eyes without flinching. I am, and now you have a choice to make. You can continue your work, knowing what it means, and perhaps find some way to reconcile duty with conscience. You can request transfer to another department, leave chronometry behind, return to ignorance as much as possible, or you can try to escalate this information to someone you believe will act differently than everyone else who's tried. Those are your options. Choose. I sat there, surrounded by the ticking of 1,700 chronometers each, one marking time that didn't matter, and felt the weight of impossible choice. Continue the lie, run from it, or speak truth and vanish into administrative euphemism like Yara Menz, like Crossed, like 19 others before me. What if, I said slowly, there's another option? What if someone compiled all this data, all the historical pattern, all the evidence of systematic concealment, and made it public? Not escalated through command structures, but simply released. Let people know what's happening. Let them decide how to respond. Severin's augmetic eyes clicked rapidly, focusing and refocusing. That's not an option, Hadrian. That's suicide followed by memory erasure. The Inquisition doesn't tolerate that kind of disclosure. You would be declared heretic, your name struck from all records, your family interviewed and adjusted, and the information itself would be suppressed, declared enemy propaganda, used as evidence of chaos corruption. You wouldn't save anyone. You'd just die badly. But people would know. Even if the information was suppressed, some people would see it before deletion. Some people would know the truth. And what would they do with it? Severin leaned forward. Panic? Riot? Abandon their posts and flee to where? There is nowhere to run from a failing astronomicon. Telling people the Emperor's light is dying doesn't prepare them for what comes after. It just destroys the present while providing no alternative for the future. She was right. I knew she was right, but accepting her logic meant accepting complicity. It meant descending the 912 steps tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Calibrating instrument that measured nothing except humanity's remaining time. Maintaining a fiction that made me part of the machinery of decline. I couldn't do it. That was the realization that settled through me like winter cold. I couldn't perform those functions anymore. Whatever I'd been before discovering this truth, I couldn't be that person again. The structure had collapsed. Duty without meaning was just motion. Faith without truth was just performance. I can't continue, I said. Severin nodded slowly. I know. I could see it when you walked in. You had the same look Yaramens had, the look of someone who's decided truth matters more than survival. She picked up a blank data slate and began entering information. I'm filing your transfer order now. Tomorrow, you'll receive notification of reassignment to specialized chronometric duty in Segmentum Solar. You'll be instructed to report within 3 days. Do you understand what that means? Yes. Do you accept it? I thought about that question. Did I accept disappearance? Did I accept becoming another name in the files, another specialist who understood too much? The alternative was performing my duty as though nothing had changed, descend those steps every morning while carrying knowledge that made mockery of purpose. I accept it, I said, but I want you to know something. Every person who's chosen silence, every person who's chosen to maintain the fiction because immediate collapse seems worse than gradual extinction, every person who's signed transfer orders or filed reports or calibrated instruments while knowing what it meant, you're all wrong. Not because the lie doesn't work. Because it does work. That's what makes it wrong. It works so well that billions of people will die in ignorance while the few who knew chose comfort over truth. Severin finished entering the data. Her hands had stopped shaking. The mask was back in place, augmetic eyes clicking with mechanical precision. You're probably right, she said, but I'll continue calibrating anyway, because I've spent 43 years building my structure. And I don't know how to be anything else. Your transfer will be processed by morning. Return to your hab. Pack your personal effects. Wait for notification. I started to leave, turned back. How many more? I asked. How many more specialists will discover this pattern before the final failure? As many as it takes, Severin replied. We'll keep training them, keep documenting the drift, keep measuring the darkness. Until there's nothing left to measure. That's the duty we've been given. That's the duty we'll perform. I left her station and walked through the archive chamber one final time. 1,700 chronometers ticking in unison, 15 specialists at their stations performing calibrations, maintaining instruments, serving the Emperor's time with precision and faith. They didn't know. Most of them would never know. They would continue their work until transfer or retirement or the final failure itself, content and purpose, certain in duty. I envied them. The ignorance I'd once possessed seemed precious now. A gift I'd discarded without understanding its value. Knowledge had cost me everything: purpose, meaning, faith, the comfortable certainty that my work mattered. That duty was sufficient justification for existence, but I couldn't unknow what I'd discovered. Couldn't unfeel the cold realization that I'd been complicit in documenting extinction. couldn't return to the person who descended those 912 steps each morning without questioning what lay at the bottom. I returned to my hab. I did not pack. Instead, I began writing, not a report, not an escalation document, just testimony. Evidence compiled from restricted files, historical patterns document in careful detail, mathematical projections of the drift acceleration, everything I discovered, everything Severine had admitted, everything the Imperium had concealed for 400 years. I wrote through the night cycle, transcribing data from memory, recreating the graphs and calculations, building a complete record of humanity's managed extinction. When I finished, I encrypted the file with protocols I'd learned maintaining archive security systems. Then I transmitted it, not to administratum command structures or sector authorities, to everywhere. Public Vox channels, astropathic relay station, data network repositories. Every destination I could access with specialist-level authorization. Thousands of copies distributed across 17 sectors before security protocols could intercept them. The arbits came at dawn. I was still at my terminal when they breached the door. I didn't resist, didn't try to explain or justify. I simply stood and placed my hands in restraint position. They were professional, efficient, speaking the formal phrases of arrest without emotion, charges of unauthorized information disclosure, violation of administrative security protocols.